at the New Amsterdam Theater in New York.
Do you know how you get to Carnegie Hall? You help create Spider-Man.
To pay tribute to the late, great Stan Lee.
When you look at all of the characters he has created, it's pretty insane.
He's sort of like this mastermind that kind of conceived all of it.
What kid growing up didn't want to be Spider-Man?
The stories.
From one series to the next, they were totally different.
The stars. Wow. And the Stan tape no one's seen until now.
Bear this in mind, my impulsive 16-year-old self.
Let's give it up for Stan Lee, guys. Woo-hoo, yeah.
I know he lives on. Stan's spirit lives on.
Celebrating Marvel's Stan Lee. Now, from Times Square in New York City, our host, Gregg.
Good evening. You may know me as Agent Phil Coulson from Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., as well as the guy who died so that the world could have the Avengers. Yes. You're welcome. Tonight we're here to remember, honor, and celebrate the amazing, the uncanny, the incredible life of our beloved Stan the Man Lee. Without Stan, there's no Spider-Man. There's no Fantastic Four. There's no Black Panther. He's the writer who gave us Hulk Smash and It's Clobbering Time and By the Eye of Agamotto. And of course, my personal favorite, Spider-Man's very own, and feel free to do it with me, Thwip. Stan was a visionary whose passion for art and storytelling left a lasting impact on pop culture and entertainment.
The best superpower. I guess Thor. Yeah, Thor. He's a god.
Spider-Man's. Spider-Man, he can shoot wet from his fingers, and that's what I want.
Captain America's ability to throw that shield. Because none of it makes sense. How does the shield always... It defies all laws of relative.
I'm gonna go with Thor because he could fly, he can travel from universes to galaxies.
If I could be any character that Stan Lee created, it would be Stan Lee himself, hands down.
Stan Lee's impact on pop culture has been revolutionary, really.
People always look to superheroes to feel good again. And I think it actually is an effect that Stan Lee has on all of us.
Stan was a superhero when it came to creating great characters and telling memorable stories.
I'm hard-pressed to think of a single living human being out there right now that has had a bigger impact on pop culture in the last century than Stan Lee. So it's just unfathomable almost.
Stan owns Halloween at this point. Dreams of little girls, little boys. What are you gonna be when you grow up? Every lunchbox, every backpack, every action figure.
It's weird to have your own action figure. It's the coolest thing in the world. There's nothing like waking up to me on the pillow next to me.
When I was about 7 years old, possibly 8 years old, somewhere in that range, I was living in Brooklyn. I loved Stan Lee.
I was so grateful for him being such a big part of my childhood. And I never outgrew it.
I remember reading comics when I was a kid. Everything Stan put into the stories, the visuals for the characters, and the way the stories were told were so vibrant and exciting.
When I was in school, in science I would learn about the sun, the moon, the stars, the comets, and the galaxies. But when I went home and read Silver Surfer or the Fantastic Four, it would take me there.
I remember being 7 or 8 years old and discovering that if I put enough pressure on either side of the door frame in my bedroom, I could climb up the door frame. I remember being rigid with excitement because I thought I might be Spider-Man.
It's unbelievable that it was conceived by one man's brain.
He's one of the founding fathers of American mythology, and I think that is going to outlast all of us.
I love drawing the Marvel heroes, and so I drew a picture of Stan Lee as a superhero. This is the drawing, You can see Stan has probably triple D breasts, and I wasn't great with pectoral muscles at the time. I had none. I still don't have any. And I wrote Manly Stanley. I was a nerd.
Please welcome to the stage, Paul Bettany.
Good evening. Stan Lee was a big thinker, one of the biggest in our lifetimes. He helped create our modern day mythology. It all started as a four-color world, instantly immortalized on newsprint and limited only by our imaginations and the staggering talent of the creators that Stan Lee collaborated with. Stan Lee wasn't just a creator of comics, he was their larger-than-life champion.
I always thought I'd be a great novelist. I never thought I'd write comics. But I needed a job, and I was just getting out of high school, and I saw an ad in the paper for an assistant needed in a comic book company, and I applied, always thinking it would be a temporary job.
Stan got a job as a teenager at a company called Timely. It was there in 1941 that Stan first gave himself the name Stan Lee.
His name was Stanley Martin Lieber. And if nobody knows this, I don't think, but I think we used to call him Martin when I was young.
And Stan Lee was just another character that Stanley Lieber created. Probably the most important, because you don't get to the Marvel Universe without the character of Stan Lee.
He would say that he took the name Stan Lee because he was saving his real name for the great American novel he was going to write.
I remember when he came to work there, he's like 17, 18-year-old kid. There were only 3 comic book people on staff. Joe Simon, the editor, Joe's partner and artist, Jack Kirby. The third one was this kid, Stan, who came in and became the Gopher. And it's interesting because those 3 names are really 3 of the most important names to emerge out of comics. One day, Simon and Kirby quit in a dispute with the publisher over money and various things, and the next thing you know, Stan is the only comics-related person in the office.
So, at a young place in his life, to make a living, he's writing all these kids' stories, but this guy longs to write something serious and be taken seriously by adults. So he gets frustrated with the comic book marketplace, writing funny animal comics and war comics and nurse comics and romance comics.
Comic books were just like a step above pornography. I mean, it was considered absolute trash.
He was sick of it. He's like, I've been through so much in this, I've gotten no reward. I've gone uncredited for most of the stories that I've been telling. You know, what is there for me to do in this genre?
Coming up.
By the early 1960s, Stan Lee thinks he's a hack. He thinks his work is useless. He thinks there's no meaning to everything he's done in comics. And he's deciding to leave the comic book business until he has a conversation with the most important person in his life. And that changes everything.
I wanted to quit. I always wanted to quit. And she said, before you quit, just for once, write the kind of stories you'd like to write. I said, we'll have to do it to make our daughter proud of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marvel's Executive Vice President and Creative Director, Joe Quesada.
Man, it's impossible to talk about Stan Lee the man without talking about Joni, his wife. Whenever Stan spoke of her, a miraculous thing would happen. The veneer of that confident huckster, it would just melt away, replaced by a starry-eyed young man who 7 years later was still wondering how the heck he got so lucky.
Well, one day he decided that maybe this was not the business he was going to be in. He was going to write a great novel or do something else, and I said to him, why don't you make them the best darned comic books in the business?
And he did, and it was the Fantastic Four, and it changed everything.
He changed what comics were. He decided with the Fantastic Four to give them personalities. Each one was different.
They were real in that they had flaws. They had personal conflicts.
It occurred to me, I'll get 4 characters, but I'll try to get them to react the way real people would react in the real world. They'll occasionally argue amongst themselves. One of them will want to quit the group because he's not getting paid enough, or the other one is getting bigger headlines or something like that.
They could be as broken as your own family, the stuff that you didn't want your friends to see at the dinner table, the eye rolling, the arguing, the throwing of things at each other.
He suddenly discovered that he was reaching the people that he had sort of thought maybe he'd reach a few of them. He was reaching them on a bigger plane than he thought he might have. And I think from that stage, I think he began to get a little more ambitious.
The work that Stan Lee collaborated on.
He created Spider-Man.
Fantastic Four.
The Hulk,
Iron Man,
Thor,
Doctor Strange,
The Avengers,
The X-Men.
the Wasp.
And it all set a foundation for what Marvel is today.
Well, when you took the modern Marvel comics started about 1962, there was almost a literal explosion of creativity that occurred at the company.
The original idea for Spider-Man was viewed as terrible to risky at best. Nobody wanted to read about teenager problems, no less than teenager problems. It was a superhero.
I'm not an incredibly scientific person, so it was easy for me to say, well, Peter Parker became Spider-Man because he was bitten by a radioactive spider.
As rumor goes, Stan put his paycheck on the line. He said, look, I'm willing to bet my paycheck, I'm willing to bet my career that this character will take off.
I remember when the idea first came up, my publisher at the time, he said, Stan, you can't do that. People hate spiders. And he said, teenagers are only sidekicks. They can't be heroes. So there was everything wrong with him, so I knew he'd succeed.
Spider-Man just wants to be a kid. His powers actually make his life harder. So a lot of superheroes you think, oh, I get superpowers, it'll make my life better. In some ways, it made the characters' lives worse.
He also desires to push beyond a lot of his limitations. He's every one of us in so many different ways, and that's one of the most globally recognized, one of the most fan-favorite characters of all time.
In the beginning at Marvel Comics, I was doing about 15 books a month, and I just couldn't keep up. I would say to the artist who's waiting, look, I don't have time to write your script now, but this is what the story ought to be. And you can be drawing that while I'm finishing this script. And I found not only did it make it go faster, but we got better stories that way, because now we were using the artist's imagination and his or her story sense as well as my own.
Stan made the bullpen a place that looked like it was part of the three-ring circus. And they would tell stories in the back of comics where he and Jack Kirby were chasing each other around wearing masks and shooting ray guns at each other.
I would just love to have been in that room with those guys when they were coming up with these ideas, where they're sitting and going like, what if a guy got hit by gamma rays and then he tore out of all of his clothes except for his pants every week?
What I liked about the Hulk, which was brilliant, and I think Stan wanted to get this across to us puny humans, was the battle that you have against yourself. No one is more flawed than Bruce Banner because of his anger issues.
Actually, he's a combination of the Frankenstein monster and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I loved that movie, Frankenstein, the one with Boris Karloff. I always thought that the monster was really the good guy, because there were all these nuts with torches chasing him and trying to kill him. He didn't want to hurt anybody. And I remember thinking, gee, I'd like to do a story that had the same feeling. Get somebody who's very ugly and very frightening looking, but he's really good, and nobody understands that.
So what makes Iron Man so compelling? What makes Iron Man so compelling is Tony Stark. You start with Tony Stark. You start with this incredibly flawed character. Tony Stark was an egocentrical jerk who, lost his heart and has to find a way to keep it alive.
From one series to the next, they were totally different. And so you had this incredibly rich Marvel universe that was wildly different depending on what artist was making that particular edition.
He was writing stories that were real. I think, it was stories about emotion, stories about courage. There were little morality plays that he preached to, and I think that was very inspirational.
The Marvel age, it was an artistic, literary, intellectual, educational, adventure revolution.
Stan Lee's created all these characters, but now he's going to go up against the guidelines that have kept comic books in line for decades. And that means that everything he's created is being put at great risk.
Our next guest saves my butt each week as an ageless warrior goddess by the name of Agent Melinda May. Please welcome the multi-award-winning queen of all fandoms and my TV girlfriend, Ming-Na Wen.
Many of Stan Lee's most famous Marvel creations came into being in the early 1960s. At a time when most of film and television were still struggling to put diverse faces on the screen, Stan recognized the diversity of our real world and an audience starved for representation. So he stepped up.
And giant presses roar into high speed. The comic section is an interesting sight.
Back in the 1950s, comic books were demonized as causing juvenile delinquency. And there was an uproar. There were hearings in Congress.
I don't think it does them a bit of good, sir, but I don't think it does them a bit of harm either.
There were newspaper articles. There were parent groups.
Their chief contention, too much time is devoted to comic books.
They all jumped on board this bandwagon. And to defend themselves, the major publishers created a combined entity called the Comics Code Authority.
If the comic code wasn't on the front of your comic book, a lot of dealers wouldn't handle it on the newsstand.
For many, many years, comics were not allowed to do stories that showed real conflict, real human conflict, because the code would come down on us.
Comics had become a kids' medium. Adults weren't reading them. They were set up with the Comics Code authorities to make them very bland and were actually kind of static and often kind of boring.
Stan felt like it was important to tell a story about drug addiction, so therefore he introduced the story of Harry Osborn, the son of the Green Goblin, how he's dealing with the trials and travails of drug addiction.
And the Comic Code Authority said, no, you're not allowed to do it. Stan published the book without the Comics Code Authority seal. And that was a huge risk because the general consensus would not buy a comic book that wasn't approved by this code authority. As it turned out, they did. That actually broke down the doors for more interesting and more adult comic book stories that followed.
Stan wanted to uplift the idea of the comic in general, but Stan enjoyed the spotlight. And so Stan was more than happy to get out front and to be the human face of Marvel.
Stan was always trying to push the boundaries and figure out a way to engage college-age audiences. In the late 60s, it was, anti-Vietnam War fervor, anti-establishment fervor.
Stan's soapbox was a place where in any of the books, Stan could write an editorial. If he had something to get off his chest, he could express it there.
In writing the soapboxes, I used to just talk to the readers, anything that came to my mind.
And he never shied away from expressing his own opinion on really large ideas.
It's not the Negro cause when you try and bring about independence for all people in this country.
Sign the treaty!
I remember reading at some point one from 1968 about the evils of bigotry.
Bigotry and racism are among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today. The bigot is an unreasoning hater, one who hates blindly, fanatically, indiscriminately.
To write about bigotry, but to also push a narrative about acceptance and equality in his stories was really forward-thinking and progressive for what was really just, people thought, superhero comics for kids.
The purity of his intentions really just leapt off the page. Everybody's valued, everybody has a voice, everybody has a story.
Stan Lee did for the world, with his Marvel universe, what politics and religion could not do. Get people to pull down the walls and look at each other to see themselves and everybody else and realize that we're all the same.
By the time I came there in '65, they didn't have a lot of, say, African-American characters yet, but Stan was very insistent on the artists putting black faces in the crowds and make sure that it wasn't just a bunch of white people.
From the creation of Luke Cage and Black Panther to, you know, Shang-Chi, the master of Kung Fu, Stan brought diversity and inclusion to the Marvel Universe before anybody.
My favorite part about the very first time Black Panther appears in Fantastic Four is that when he takes his mask off in that last page, the characters don't go, "Oh my God, it's a black superhero." No, the characters say, "Oh my God, it's the King of Wakanda." That's the point. So Stan pushed everything forward without having to say, "Hey, ladies and gentlemen, get ready for America's first black superhero." That wasn't the point. The point was, this guy's a hero through and through, regardless of his skin color, and that's why we should accept him, because he is a great guy.
Not only was Marvel, you know, about making great books with great content, but they were socially aware of what was going on at the point in time and, you know, trying to speak subliminally to an audience that was marginalized.
So in addition to Stan's soapbox, he wanted to use the comics themselves to make some sort of social commentary, and that's where the X-Men came in, because they were this team of mutants with these superhuman abilities who were feared and were seen by other humans as outcasts.
And they were a group and a family in uniforms and living together, etc., very much the way the Fantastic Four were. We had 5 different characters, 6 counting Professor Xavier, and they didn't speak alike, they didn't think alike, so there were a lot of possibilities.
There's a very important social metaphor there, in that these are people who, through no choice of their own, are born different.
When I was a kid, when I first started reading the X-Men, I felt sorry for them. And something in me reading those books made me, why do the humans hate them? Because they're different. These guys are being persecuted, you know what I'm saying? And it wasn't just blacks, Asians, anybody who ever got discriminated against. Because they're different. That's the first thing that I got out of the X-Men.
Just to be so in tune with your universe, dealing with social issues that affect people that are marginalized.
I think that the thing that makes it matter is the humanity. Humans care about humans who care about humans. Stan taught the reader to care, and it made the stories matter. I mean, what do humans want more than to matter and to be told that they matter?
Coming up, you know, Stan created a bunch of characters that he knew could play outside of comic books.
Stan was going to go to Hollywood and somehow turn these Marvel superheroes into movie superstars.
Please welcome to the stage, from Marvel's Daredevil, Deborah Ann Wall.
Hi everyone, this is such an honor. To say that Stan Lee's work and influence has simply impacted pop culture today would be a tremendous understatement. It is still growing. Even to this day, just 10 years ago, comic books were largely still a secret language, spoken only by hardcore devotees. But because of the strength of these characters and the timelessness of their core stories, Stan's lifelong dream of seeing Marvel come to life on the screen was realized beyond even his own imagining.
You know, I think Stan going to Hollywood was him trying to explore other means of storytelling. Where could he take the Marvel universe next?
Stan was going to try to get movies and television interested in Marvel characters. You had animated series, Captain America.
I was really little then. Those things were captivating. And it wasn't like they would animate the movie. They would just take a picture of Captain America and move him across the screen.
I mean, what kid growing up didn't want to be Spider-Man?
Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
He was the narrator of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which is one of my favorite cartoons of all time. And he brought you into every adventure. Hey, Spider Friends, this is Stan Lee.
Face front, heroes, this is Stan Lee.
It was high energy and had a lot of exuberance. It did not disappoint. That voice is going to be around and will always be part of who we are.
Stan was very smart in that every generation had a Spider-Man cartoon. And so if you were 5, 15, 25, you were still being indoctrinated.
Excuse me, I'm looking for some guy named Stan Lee.
What? Spider Spider-Man?
That clip is such a great example of just how pure of heart Stan is. Like his entire presence, he's just full of joy.
That's Stan Lee. He's quite a guy.
The X-Men cartoon was one of the biggest steps forward for Marvel in any medium, because what that did was it created strong female heroes in animation that so many young girls at that point watched.
I love seeing Spider-Man on Electric Company. To see Spider-Man, to see your favorite Marvel superheroes in places other than a comic book was a blessing.
He knew that by getting together with the Electric Company, there would be a way for him to tell stories that would reach a younger group.
Ugh, Spider-Man!
The transition of Stan's early TV shows into mainstream took time, and no one was quite sure of the direction that it was going to go. There were a lot of failures.
I remember watching the Spider-Man television show, and with that actor, he had great hair, and playing Peter Parker.
They didn't have the technology to do it. His crawling up the walls, they just, they towed him up a rope and he just went like this. So on the page, these images and characters were exciting and like, oh, look at what they could do. They couldn't pull it off in real life.
What did break through was
my grandfather said, and they said the guy here, he likes to say hello to you. His name is Stan Lee. He looked at me, he said, something you need to work out.
Don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
This was played as a real drama of a man who had a real problem, which was that he turned into the Incredible Hulk.
You got yourself an Incredible Hulk TV show. And we had all that great animation. Getting the movie going, which was his big dream, took much longer.
It took Hollywood decades to figure out and catch up to the incredible stories that Stan was telling, but also Jack Kirby's visuals.
Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Stan Lee. They grew up reading his comic books. They went on to tell these mainstream stories that people absolutely loved. And I'm sure Stan saw that and was like, yeah, my stuff, our stuff, the Marvel stuff would play incredibly well in a movie.
Don't you people ever die?
Would join forces to do X-Men. The first thing that we pulled from Stan was the theme of tolerance.
one of the film's characters is initially shown at a concentration camp during World War II.
The idea of opening it with Magneto at the camps in Nazi Germany. We were now in a very real-life drama. People who had never read the comics, they were just watching a good movie. But when you're talking about a blockbuster, the world changed when Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire made Spider-Man 1.
It's Spider-Man!
I loved it. I thought it was amazing to see that world brought to life.
Dude, I'll never forget the scene when he's fighting the Green Goblin.
For Stan Lee, it was a dream come true to see these characters brought to life in the most high quality way possible.
He was like a kid in the candy store. He saw it, I think, 5 or 6 times. He was thoroughly convinced that for the first time, there was going to be a Stan Lee superhero movie that would be for the ages. It was a magic time.
Stan Lee was amazing, not just because he created the Marvel Universe. He then carried the Marvel Universe across the country in his head to Los Angeles. Our universe doesn't exist. Our culture doesn't exist if Stan doesn't begin another career as a film producer.
The Spider-Man movies are doing great, but they were made by other studios. And now Marvel wants to make their own movies. And when they succeed, it changes everything.
You know, you never forget your first death.
And I'm honored that mine came at the hands of the one and only, the magnificent Loki himself, Tom Hiddleston.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Clark. I'm sorry. I love you too. But how do I put this? Stan Lee is in more movies than I am. I don't take it personally. Stan Lee is in more movies than most actors I've ever worked with. And here's an odd show business secret. Most writers do not have cameos in dozens of movies. But Stan Lee wasn't just a writer. He was a star. Stan recognized early in his career that the tens of thousands of pages of Marvel Comics were ready-made storyboards for cosmic adventures that could not yet be filmed. And it would take decades for visual effects technology to catch up to the visions of Marvel's artists. But when that day finally came, Stan was ready for his close-up.
I thought he'd be taller. Oh, gee, I've got so many more stories to tell.
The Marvel Cinematic Universe kicked open its doors way late in Stan's life. Long past the point, I think, Stan had given up the dream of all these characters becoming movies.
So the successful Spider-Man franchise and the X-Men franchise had been made by other studios. Now Marvel wanted to do it themselves. They were going to spend their own money, but they decided to do it behind a slightly unexpected character, Iron Man.
Iron Man I had known from growing up. There was often a playfulness about the tone. Stan Lee infused it with a certain sense of humor. Now Marvel is seen as an established brand, and they could take a lot of chances.
E-Mark.
But at the time, we had one bullet, and it had to work.
The way the audience responded, whether they'd ever read comics or not, was spectacular.
We felt the wave of the audience.
Iron Man had his books, Thor had his books, Cap had his books. So it was really important to me that we introduced them all first before putting them together.
When you have Thor, you have Iron Man, you have Hulk, you have Captain America, you couldn't make the Avengers happen.
It's the Academy Awards in the comic world.
It's entertaining, and we just want people to come in and have a lot of fun.
It's a really good group. Black Panther.
The idea of this is honestly a dream come true.
I mean, the huge question will always be, how did what Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and their bullpen create in the 1960s result in their characters taking over the pop culture world 40 years after the fact?
It's a testament to what great characters they are, that new writers and new artists continue to refine and redefine and keep breathing new life into those characters, which I think is what we're doing now. We're all just stewards of these characters.
I mean, you could come up with the most spectacular, far-fetched idea, concept, worlds within worlds, I don't care what it is. You can put it on film, clearly, graphically, understandably, and excitedly.
And meanwhile, this new generation of filmmakers, just like the fans, really love Stan Lee. And so it became a fun thing to see Stan Lee turn up in a cameo in a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie.
Action? Trust me, true believer. Not only did I not think I would be doing a cameo in such a big movie, I never dreamt there'd be such a big movie. All of a sudden, these characters have become world famous. They're the subject of blockbuster movies, and I'm lucky enough to get little cameos in them.
Those movies reintroduced him to a whole new generation of people. And the idea of the Where's Waldo game of sticking Stan into the movies lent it even more authenticity.
Did it work?
You're watching the movie not only because you want to watch the movie, but you're waiting for where's Stan's cameo.
Well, the 60s were fun, but now I'm paying for it.
The cameos always had this kind of delightful breaking of the fourth wall element, because you could literally see on camera how much fun Stan was having doing it. He never hid it, and he never tried to be cool, which is what made him cool.
That's one of the best parts of every one of these Marvel movies is seeing Stan in that moment.
Are you Tony Stank?
My favorite Stan Lee cameo was when he was in the museum as the security guard.
Oh, man. I am so fired.
And it's touching to me that he would value his career as a cameo guy.
When I was young, I thought I really wanted to be an actor. I was in the WPA Federal Theater, and I loved acting, but you couldn't make any money at it in those days, or at least I couldn't.
Stan's game for anything. That's the best part about him. He loves to have fun and is fearless and shameless about it.
Make love, not war.
Who the hell goes out at 94 on top? It just defies all logic.
Stan is the link back to the moment when you first encountered these characters. And so Stan is that tether back to what makes Marvel special.
When Stan Lee became a Disney legend a few years ago, he mentioned in his speech that Walt Disney was an idol of his. And I thought about that a lot, because I think if Walt had lived longer, Stan probably would have been an idol of Walt's.
Stan's creations are a gift, but the real honor was being in his presence on set. It is a rare thing to speak to a living legend about his creations, and even rarer to walk alongside him in a giant recreation of his own mind. Stan Lee started a story with no end, and it changed the world. We couldn't stop now if we tried. Enough said.
Coming up next, a long-lost tape from Stan, only now seeing the light of day for the first time.
Dear Stan, I still remember how you always wanted to be a writer.
South Dakota files a challenge to the Equal Rights Amendment. That story in 10.
Finally tonight, it wouldn't be a show about Marvel and Stan Lee if the man himself didn't get a word in edgewise. What you're about to see was discovered in the archives of ABC News. It's never-before-seen footage of Stan reading a letter to his younger self. So, as we say goodnight, I very willingly turn the final moments of our broadcast over to the man himself, Stan Lee.
Dear Stan, I still remember how you always wanted to be a writer. In your last year at DeWitt Clinton High School, you practiced signing your name, Stanley Martin Lieber, over and over again, making it look as bold and impressive as any of those at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence. You were so certain the day would come when you'd write that great American novel and people would ask for your autograph, and you wanted to be prepared. Well, how could you have imagined the ironic development in later years? Today, people do occasionally request your autograph, but not for the great American novel, which you never wrote, but rather for the oh-so-often maligned comic books, which nobody ever respected years ago. And even more ironic, the name you now sign is Stan Lee, which you adopted legally because you were embarrassed that Stanley M. Lieber was writing those lowly comics, which have since become the wellspring for respected motion pictures, TV series, video games, and all sorts of enormously popular globe-spanning entertainment. So bear this in mind, my impulsive 16-year-old self. Nothing ever stays the same. Tastes change, and the culture changes. The important thing is to stay on top of what is au courant and to be resilient enough to go with the flow and change with the tide. And if you're lucky enough to be one who contributes to the change in culture, never forget your roots or those who helped you make the grade. Excelsior. You, Stanley.
The fall of Jim and Tammy Faye Baker was a